This could be a big week for the conflict in Ukraine as Presidents Trump and Putin prepare to meet face-to-face in Alaska.
We talk to the hosts of Ukraine the Latest, Nicholls and Dearnley, about the possibilities for peace, and would peace even be a good thing?
Nobody is talking about the tens of thousands of kidnapped children by Russia. If it's allowed that these children just are now forced to live in Russia, that were taken away from the occupied territories and not returned to Ukraine, then what kind of precedent does that send to the world? And indeed, what does that mean for the fate of not just those children, but millions of people in the occupied territories?
Dom, you're about to head off to Alaska very shortly for this summit. What do we know about the possible concessions that Zelensky may be about to agree to that may be discussed between Trump and Putin?
Okay, so the bluff, bottom line up front, not a lot. We are doing a bit of interpretation about some of the softening of his language. I think that's, if I've given that enough caveats.
Yep.
He seems to have introduced the idea that, which may be a reflection on reality, you might suggest, that if the line were frozen as it is, where the rough contact line is between Ukraine and Russia at the moment, those areas of the four southeastern oblasts, the regions of Ukraine that are held by, or mostly held by Russia, that Russia only holds 75% of three of them, most of Luhansk, but only 75% of the others. By no means does Russia hold all of this area. However, if the line were to be frozen where it is, President Zelensky seems to have come around to the idea that he may be able to move on with de facto recognition of that. So not de jure, not a change in law, not an acceptance that is now part of Russia, but just a realization that this is the facts on the ground for now. And if that's a stumbling block, then it needs to be put to one side and move on from there. So it is a bit of interpretation of the language, but then this is a guy who doesn't just pick any old words. You know, he knows what he's saying when he releases these phrases and these public statements.
Can you give us a sense of the proportion of Ukrainian land that is?
Russia currently sits on about 19-20% of Ukrainian land.
So a lot.
So, reasonable, and it's important land. So, Crimea for starters, and then the oblasts in the southeast, Zaporizhia and Kherson, that have coastline on the Sea of Azov and on the Dnieper River, which is very important for trade and for their agriculture industry, and so reaching out to the world and engaging economically. So yes, it is a reasonable amount. It's barely changed in the last 18 months to 2 years. When we talk about incremental advances, you shouldn't overlook these. These are villages. These are people who are being shoved away from their homes or killed. However, Russia has not advanced very far in the last couple of years, but the areas that they do have control of is sizable and is in some very important economic land for Ukraine.
Francis, what do the Ukrainian people make of this idea of allowing the Russians to just stay where they are?
Well, for a very, very long time, the Ukrainian people have been incredibly robust in their rejection of any deal which would see territory formally ceded to Russia. And I think that still remains in place, although there have been some interesting polls recently that have suggested a shift, that there are more people in the country who are willing to accept something like this in order to try and end this war. And we know and have reported, obviously, many, many times just how extraordinarily high on both sides the casualties are. I think there's another angle to this as well that's important to mention, which is that as we speak, European leaders are frantically trying to support Ukraine before this meeting between Trump and Putin.
There'll be some land swapping going on. I know that through Russia and through conversations with everybody, for the good of Ukraine. Good stuff, not bad stuff. Also, some bad stuff for both. So there's good and there's bad. But it's very complex because you have lines that are very uneven, and there'll be some swapping, there'll be some changes in land, and the word that they will use is, they make changes. We're going to change the lines, the battle lines. Russia's occupied a big portion of Ukraine. They've occupied some very prime territory. We're going to try and get some of that territory back for Ukraine.
They are trying to give some political cover and say, look, we agree with the Ukrainians that you cannot have a situation for their security and for our own where land that is taken by force becomes part of that enemy country. And so I think it is also important to see this as potentially a positioning by Ukraine, by Europe, that means that Trump can't point at Ukraine and blame them for not giving an inch. And that saying that Putin is willing to do X, Y, and Z, which he probably isn't, by the way, and I think that's an important point here. There's no evidence that he's abandoned his maximalist objectives in Ukraine. But not blaming the Ukrainians, but rather being able to put more pressure on Putin at some point. But of course, what we've really seen now for years is a failure for Europe to put itself into a position where it has to be part of any peace talks. You know, we haven't seen European troops on the ground. We haven't seen them making pledges for Ukraine that would guarantee certain territories for them by force if necessary. We haven't seen them putting in an air defence to stop missiles attacking the cities. They have tried to keep out as much as possible. And of course, what that means is that you can have a situation where Trump and Putin meet and discuss and try and make deals over the heads of the Europeans. It's a pretty desperate situation for Europe as well as Ukraine.
When I saw the headline this morning, my reaction was, ooh, light at the end of the tunnel, because the administration has long argued that it's Zelensky's stubbornness which makes it hard to talk peace, because he wouldn't give up any land. If Zelensky is willing to do that, then doesn't this call Putin's bluff? Because now Putin really has to talk seriously about peace, because the Ukrainians are willing to cede something here.
I think the problem with that perspective is that do we really believe what Putin is saying here? And there's been all sorts of miscommunications this past week or so. In fact, actually, there's been an argument that the only reason these talks are taking place was because of a miscommunication, where it was believed that the Russians are willing to agree to something like this. And there's no evidence necessarily that they actually are willing to agree to a ceasefire in order to secure these oblasts, these regions that Don was just talking about. And I think we've seen time and time again, to answer your question directly, evidence that really, for all of the talk about putting pressure on Putin and the ball being in his court, and Trump has talked about that, really they have not done anything to really try and compel Russia to go to the negotiating table. There is clearly, and we saw in the remarks that Trump was making in a press conference yesterday, that seemed pretty sympathetic to the Russian position as opposed to the Ukrainian one. There's very little evidence that really this White House doesn't blame the Ukrainians, doesn't blame Russia, but rather blames the Ukrainians for what has taken place.
It's a wing and a prayer, but if this is the offer which leads eventually to peace, and if Putin gained de facto control of that land, would that mean, Dom, a victory for Putin? Could he say domestically, I won this?
Well, he can say whatever he likes domestically, and people will go, "Oh yes, absolutely, Vladimirovich, we believe you all along." I mean, the way we receive information in this country and arguably the West is very different to how it happens in Russia. So he can say whatever he likes. It wouldn't be a victory for him. He has not moved back 1 inch from his maximalist aims of taking over the whole country, limiting the size of Ukraine's armed forces, saying it can't be a part of NATO, etc., etc. So on that front, this would absolutely not be anywhere near that. Conversely, Russia denies the very existence of Ukraine, denies it has any agency as a sovereign state. So every day that Ukraine continues to exist and exact its own will over its own people and territory is a defeat for Russia. So, quite what is a victory and a defeat right now, it's very, very difficult to say. I don't think there's going to be anything hard out of this Alaska summit, apart from my massive expenses bill, quite frankly, because Putin just wants to kick the can down the road. He does not want to stop. He believes the wind is in his sails. He believes he has the momentum on the battlefield. He doesn't want to turn around to his people to say, right, we're all coming home, job done, because he doesn't want 600,000 heavily armed, somewhat traumatized and very aggressive men back on the streets of Russia. He wants to keep going. So he will be looking for a way. What he wants to achieve out of this summit is to say to Donald Trump, you see, I'm totally serious about these negotiations. I turned up, I offered all these concessions. Obviously, we had to have a few things had to be put in place first of all before we could have some completely unconditional meetings. But he said, I turned up, I'm willing to do it. The other side are not. The other side are the obstacle. Zelensky and Europe are the obstacles to peace now. I'm not. I'm here. I've turned up. I'm acting in good faith. If he can get any kind of de facto recognition of the Eastern Oblasts and any sanctions relief, he'll be even happier. But what he wants to achieve out of this is to be seen on the world stage, shaking hands with Donald Trump, and to get away quite happily with a few headlines.
Francis, presumably, if we do end up in a position where President Zelensky makes clear that he is prepared to allow Russia to effectively keep the land it's taken, he's going to need to show his people that he has got something in return, and presumably the thing he wants in return is NATO membership.
Yes, I think that there are arguments swirling at the moment about what exactly the Ukrainian position is on those matters, which really are important. NATO membership being one, or a pathway. So, in essence, Kyiv not agreeing to something that would mean they could never go down that path, which is, of course, something that Putin wants. The other, I think, key element here is the continuing support in terms of weapons and financial support. That's something, again, that Moscow has been very, very reluctant to agree to, but it will be absolutely essential from the perspective of Ukraine to ensure that whatever is agreed, if, and it is a big if, ensures that they are going to be able to continue to receive arms from the West and from their allies to, in essence, build it's sometimes articulated as porcupine Ukraine. You make such a buttress, a bit like a South Korea type situation, that means that any attempt to invade in the future would be a fool's errand. And the other, I think, element of this as well is making sure that there would be even stronger robustness against attempts of political influence over Kyiv and over Ukraine from the Kremlin as well. So there are lots of key principles here that aren't being talked about at all yet in the public sphere. I'm sure they are privately. The other, of course, being as well as nobody is talking about the tens of thousands of kidnapped children by Russia. If it's allowed that these children just are now forced to live in Russia, that were taken away from the occupied territories and not returned to Ukraine, then what kind of precedent does that send to the world? And indeed, what does that mean for the fate of not just those children, but millions of people in the occupied territories? There were many who argued only a year ago that if we ended up in this position, it was absolutely integral that Ukrainians could choose to leave the occupied territories. But it doesn't look like that's even a subject of discussion at the moment.
What do we think is going to happen from here on in, if we're going to sort of look at the sort of big picture here? I mean, you guys have been doing this podcast for 3.5 years effectively. Presumably you never thought you were still going to be having to do a podcast 3.5 years on. It's been incredibly successful and people are fascinated by it. But where do you see the future?
Well, Russia cannot defeat Ukraine militarily. Ukraine cannot shove Russia off Ukrainian land militarily. So I think what seems to be reflected in these recent comments by President Zelensky is about where we are. Now it's largely in the gift sounds too flippant, but Europe can play a big part here. So at the moment, where does Ukraine get its weapons from? Just over half they produce themselves. About 25% comes from Europe and 20%-ish from the United States. The last drawdown from the Biden administration is still being worked through. The last bits and bobs are still on their way. There's been no new presidential drawdown under Donald Trump. So at the moment, the majority of weapons are from Ukraine. Of course, the US supply the all-important air defense missiles. But if there was some kind of ceasefire along the lines where they are at the moment, then there's nothing to suggest that Ukraine and Europe couldn't arm Ukraine to the extent that it becomes just unworkable for Putin to think that he can do it again try again in 10 years' time. So there is a very real possibility here that Europe could play a major role if it steps up and if it organises through this new bank, the new Defence and Resilience Bank, about funding for defence and security purposes. This could actually be the new European security architecture, including obviously Ukraine, part of Europe. So that could be the future, even if the United States decided to walk away, and even if it just relies on a transactional, they will allow Europe to buy weapons, but there's no sort of value here, no sort of post Cold War standing up for the values of the NATO alliance. So it is within the power of Europe to do this. Retired General Sir Richard Barrons makes the point that the combined total GDP of just the European NATO nations is 17 times that of Russia. He said this is not a question of numbers, it's just political will. So it can be done. If Europe works out that they really have to, if only for their own security, if you take it right back to very selfish means, just for European security, they've got to do something about this new resurgent Russia with its tail up, having had a victory in Ukraine. Europe can do it, but they're just not really stepping up at the moment. I mean, it's the old question about if the US president picks up the phone to Europe, who do they call? Well, I don't know who that would be today. Poland's looking pretty good, Friedrich Merz, but no one's really gripping this and saying, here's a plan for the future, this is what we'll do. I hear from very senior defence officials that the coalition of the willing, remember that? Coalition of the willing has actually, is good to go in some form. Like, well, what does that mean? It wouldn't be drawn. However, unless and until Europe actually gets involved militarily with people in the country, just having a sky shield, this air policing role, won't cut it. It's too easy to run away, so it neither deters Russia nor reinforces Ukraine. So you've got to put people on the ground, and unless and until Europe do that in a meaningful way, backed up with defence industrial cooperation over the long term, then we're going to be back here for years with the little bits and bobs and the latest crisis seen off at the last moment, hopefully, and we're just going nowhere.
Francis, might the outcome look something like Korea, where you have a conflict that's frozen? Neither side recognises the victory or defeat of the other. They tacitly agree not to start the war again, but they quietly arm both sides so that no one could win if anyone tried anything.
It's conceivable, but I think would be a disastrous outcome from what other options were on the table. I think we can pretty safely say now, knowing what we know, that there were opportunities in the first months of the war, particularly certainly the first year of the war, to defeat the Russians decisively militarily and to push them out of certainly more territory than they occupy today and to put them in a much more vulnerable strategic position. And I think we have to very seriously ask ourselves in Europe, to Dom's point, whether an outcome where you have a sort of return to that Cold War Iron Curtain border, where you've got countries that are, as you say, in this constant state of almost war, immense tensions, would be a successful outcome for the long-term security. And there are, I think, relevant to the question that you asked, Gordon, about the future, is do we really believe that this Russia is likely to stop? And I think that we have to, if you look at the evidence, say it is statistically less likely that they will. They have built a war economy. They've built an enormous armed forces. History suggests time and time again that when you have countries that evolve into these fascistic states, it's very difficult for them to just wind down overnight. The likelihood is that they will probe elsewhere and continue perhaps even to probe in Ukraine if there were some kind of deal, even if it was a freezing akin to North and South Korea. So I think that there is going to have to be very serious questions asked about the long-term security for Europe, which, to Dom's point, Ukraine will be integral to. In the worst case scenarios of imagining, if not now, then in a longer-term future where, let's say, there was a political seizing of power by Moscow in Kyiv, that would now be a drone superpower with the largest armed forces in Europe turned around and facing Western Europe if Ukraine fell. We need to be very, very serious about how serious it would be if Ukraine were not to be part of the Western security apparatus. And I, to that point, would say that a North-South Korea divide where a country is still belligerent and believes that it has achieved something is a hostage to fortune.